Throughout our history, empires have succeeded one another. Some have brought peace and prosperity to their subjects, while others have pursued brutal policies of tyranny. Here are some of the darkest empires of the past, each of which could well be called an evil empire. The tribes, close in language and culture, known in history under the name of Celts. This name comes from the ancient Greeks. The Romans called them Gauls, about 3,000 years ago settled almost all over Europe. Their stay on the continent was marked by many advances in material culture, which their neighbors also enjoyed. The Celts ruled much of present-day France, Belgium, and England. Even Rome found it extremely difficult to conquer the Celts. Why? Brutality. Barbarians, according to the same Romans, could go into the battlefield without any clothes at all. Painted with paint and blood faces, ferocious temper, the Celts planted a cult of violence on their territory. In France, archaeologists discovered embalmed heads in a fortified Iron Age settlement known as Le Caillard. The gruesome find confirms the legendary brutality of ancient Celtic tribes. In particular, the heads indicate that the Celts were indeed unusual in celebrating victory over their enemies. Defeated enemies were beheaded, tied up with ropes and hung on horses. This was not the end of it, and after the Celts embalmed them and kept them in their homes as trophies. According to Live Science, this was considered an attribute of status and power. The researchers found the embalmed heads on a small hill near the Rhone River. The find dates back to the 3rd century BC. If someone's head was of special value to them, it was embalmed and displayed at feasts as eloquent proof of the valor of the owner of the trophy. Perhaps, when a Celt was alone with his trophy, he moved his jaws, imagining that the talking head was showering him with compliments. By the way, they tore off the heads for a reason, because the ancient Celts believed that it is in the head is the human soul, and if you cut off the head of the enemy before the soul left it, then you become the happy owner of someone's soul. The find belongs to the finder. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was the bloodiest military conflict in the history of the United States of America. Losses of both sides killed more than 625,000 people, more than 400,000 were wounded. The consequence of the Civil War was a radical change in the image of the state. As befits an event of such scale, the American Civil War is surrounded by many myths, spread both in America itself and abroad. In 1861, the Confederate States of America were 11 states that opposed the United States of America, formed as a result of the secession of 11 southern slave states from the United States. This country was not recognized by any foreign country, but the Confederacy had its own money, its own president, and cultural identity. Nothing good happened in the self-designated empire. Millions of African Americans suffered under the heel of racists. Fortunately, the Confederate States of America ceased to exist in 1865. Vikings, early medieval Scandinavian seafarers, who in the 8 to 11 centuries made sea voyages from Vinland to Biarmia and from the Caspian Sea to North Africa. They were mostly free peasants of Danish, Norwegian and Swedish origin, who were pushed out of their native countries by overpopulation and thirst for easy profit. Religiously, they were overwhelmingly pagan. Since 793 Vikings became a serious problem for England, the Frankish state, Spain and Russia. As time went on, the Danes and Norwegians became more and more brutal. The devastation of England under King Ethelred the Indecision allowed the Vikings to see significant territories. Scattered settlements turned into a real empire. The peculiarity of Viking war tactics is the complete destruction of everything connected with religions alien to them, monasteries, temples, including the ministers of these religions. This was so frightening to those around them that the inhabitants of villages, who barely saw the masts of Viking ships on the horizon, fled without a fight. However, everything comes to an end. In 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, nicknamed the Hardy, was defeated by the English at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. By the way, interesting fact, in many feature films and cartoons Vikings are shown as dirty and wild men and women, but in fact they took care of their appearance. Combs, tweezers, and razors are the most common finds in excavations of Viking settlements. Remains of soap, which the Vikings made themselves, have also been found. In England, the Vikings, on the contrary, were considered clean because they washed once a week, on Saturday. In Scandinavian languages, the word Saturday still means bath day, although the Viking descendants themselves do not think about it at all. The Native Americans also had their own empire. The Comanches ruled much of the prairie, consolidating their position by brutal raids on other tribes. The Comanches were characterized by a perverse cruelty to their captives. They tortured captured Europeans not to extract any information, but only to inflict terror on anyone who trespassed on their territory. No one was spared. Captives were skinned alive, tied to anthills, hung over fires, had tendons cut in their legs and left to die of hunger and thirst in the desert. Women were sexually abused. Comanches did not spare even children. They were either killed immediately or left in the tribe to do the dirtiest and hardest work. By the way, women took an active part in the torture of those captured. Ladies of the Comanche tribe were not familiar with compassion and pity. Some torturers brought their sons with them to become men, watching the nightmare that took place in the Indian settlement after each fight. It was the Comanches who stopped the Spanish advance from south to north. The French were also unable to advance west of Louisiana because of Comanche resistance. And this persistent struggle of the tribe stopped for as long as 40 years the development of central Texas and other plain states amidst the active settlement and development of the west and east coasts of North America. Comanches nowadays live mainly in the territory of the state of Oklahoma. There are very few of them left, about 15,000 people. The name of the New Zealand tribe, Maori, means ordinary, although, in truth, there is nothing ordinary about them. Charles Darwin, who met them during his voyage on the Beagle, noted their cruelty, especially towards whites, Englishmen, with whom they had to fight for territories during the Maori Wars. The Maori are considered the autochthonous people of New Zealand. Their ancestors came to the island approximately 2,000 to 700 years ago from eastern Polynesia. Until the arrival of the British in the mid-19th century, they had no serious enemies, entertained mainly by feuds. During this time formed their unique customs, peculiar to many Polynesian tribes. For example, they cut off the heads of captured enemies and ate their bodies, so, according to their beliefs, the strength of the enemy passed to them. Unlike their neighbors, Australian Aborigines, Maori participated in 2 world wars. And during the Second World War, they themselves insisted on forming their own 28th Battalion. By the way, it is known that during the First World War they drove away the enemy with their battle dance, haku, during the offensive operation on the Gallipoli Peninsula. This ritual was accompanied by war cries and fearful faces, which, literally, discouraged the enemy and gave the Maori an advantage. And here's what we know about the Maori war against another tribe on the island. The Maori became furious when the Moriori refused to work and tried to talk about their rights. There was a terrible massacre. 3/4 of the islanders died. Those who died from a bullet, a knife or a club to the back of the head were lucky. The Maori used to carry out executions with showy brutality to intimidate. Virtually all survivors were beaten, raped, mutilated. There was no escape. Experienced Maori warriors scoured the remotest areas of Chatham. At least 300 people were ostentatiously slaughtered and eaten. The remaining Moriori were kept in pens like cattle and used as slaves. They were forbidden to speak their own language, to marry, and forced to desecrate all shrines. An English explorer who visited the archipelago a few years later described Moriori life as the worst kind of slavery, far worse than death. In the late 19th century, under the guise of spreading civilization, Belgian King Leopold II appropriated vast territories in Africa and turned the Congo into his own labor camp. For more than 20 years, the Congolese were Leopold's real slaves, during which time the Congo's population was nearly halved. The Belgian colonial empire consisted of 3 African colonies in the Congo. The territory was 76 times the size of Belgium itself, the recognized private property of King Leopold II. This same king went down in history as the Butcher of the Congo, for killing millions of Congolese forced to labor on rubber plantations. 1884 to 1885. A conference of European powers gathered in Berlin to discuss spheres of influence in Africa. Passions were running high. In those days every state dreamed of getting a share of the untold African riches. By that time, Leopold already controlled vast territories in the Congo basin, but it was at the Berlin Conference that he was officially recognized as the sole ruler of the Congo Free State. The king's actions in the Congo were no longer restricted. The Congolese became real slaves of Leopold II, who turned the country into a kind of labor camp. The entire population of Congo was obliged to work for the Belgian king, mainly people were employed on rubber plantations. The amount of rubber extracted in the Congo during Leopold's reign increased almost 200 times. Ivory mining also brought great profits. Even small children worked. Those who did not fulfill their ration were beaten and maimed. To keep the Congo's huge population under control, detachments of social forces were created. From time to time they marched through villages and carried out demonstrative executions of the unruly. Soldiers were required to provide the severed hands of those killed as proof of the need for ammunition. If the soldiers spent more ammunition than the norm, they cut off the hands of living people as well. Belgium looked past the acts of their king. The newspapers explained the cruelty to the locals as a reaction to the cruel morals of the Congolese themselves. Cannibalism was still rampant in the country at that time. In 20 years, the country's population had almost halved, that is, about 10 million Congolese died.